Welcome to Androscoggin County, founded on March 18th, 1854, and named after the Androscoggin tribe of Abenaki people, who were originally called the Aroostook tribe, but Massachusetts Governor Edmund Andros changed it to Androscoggin. The 2019 census estimated a population of 108,277 people. It is also the focus for week 3 of the Jumping Frenchman podcast's Haunted County Countdown. I'm Joe Ouellette, the host of the Jumping Frenchman podcast, and there are 16 counties in Maine, and I'm going to look at one a week until Halloween. We've already looked at York and Cumberland counties, so let's take a look at Androscoggin. We start our episode in the town of Lewiston, the biggest city in Maine, which is a fact that surprised me when I learned it. And we also start with a story from a friend of the show, Michelle Souliere, and her book / website, Strange Maine, True Tales from the Pine Tree State. This is the story of Riverside Cemetery, which many people have had different experiences in. One of the best known stories is that of Michelle Souliere, who wrote about her experience with the Libby Mausoleum. Winfield Scott Libby was a businessman in Lewiston. He owned the W.S. Libby Company, which brought a lot of business to the area. Currently rests in a mausoleum with his wife and other members of his family, and it seems someone, maybe even Scott himself, is protecting his resting place from those who chose to be less than respectful. Although it seems our friend Michelle seemed to be the most respectful. I'll read you an excerpt from her wonderful book, Strange Maine, True Tales from the Pine Tree State. Quote, "There was a tension building in the air, and I felt like someone was glaring at me. Nikki was picking up on it too, and I decided to attempt to communicate with the presence. I started to get really cold, and I told Mike and Nikki that I was getting some really bad vibes off this place. When Nikki lit up a cigarette, I felt a shift come over the air, like it had become charged, and I felt my stomach bottom out. I had turned around and was actually walking away from the crypt when I heard Nikki yelp, followed by a loud cracking noise. I turned just in time to see Nikki running towards me as the top half of a birch tree snapped off and came crashing down where we had been standing. As the shock of what had just happened started to sink in, I became acutely aware that the presence I had felt at the mausoleum was now bearing down on the three of us. I started to run as hard as I could, occasionally looking over my shoulder to see if Mike and Nikki were okay. I never actually saw anything tangible, but still got a sense that whoever or whatever it was not very far behind me until I had passed the winter storage shed. End excerpt. Before that excerpt, she mentions picking up trash and talking about a dog defecating on somebody else's cemetery. The Lewiston Cemetery has had problems in the past with vandalism and graffiti. The Libby Mausoleum itself had its windows kicked in at some point. I wouldn't blame Libby or any of his family members to protect his area, his final burial place. I don't think anyone else would, but that is all for this segment. And before we go, I also want once again to mention that you can read the rest of the story in Strange Maine, True Tales from the Pine Tree State. We now go to the Auburn Public Library, which seems to be haunted by the very first librarian it ever had. Annie Prescott was the first librarian at the Auburn Public Library, and she liked to walk along the balcony that overlooked the entire main floor. Apparently, she still does this, according to one ghost hunter who was interviewed by the Sun Journal. To quote him, "We asked if she was here. She answered that she was." End quote. I know this is a small story, and it's more transitional than anything. I felt inclined to include it because it genuinely impressed me to see such a kind ghost haunting a library. Because when you do imagine ghosts haunting libraries, you picture that opening scene in Ghostbusters. But it seems to me that Annie Prescott is just doing her job long after her shift is over. Let us now take a drive to Poland, Maine. We're going to visit the Poland Springs Resort. All you have to do is head up Route 26. Maybe we'll stop and pick up a hitchhiker. Yes, the famous vanishing hitchhiker cliche, an oldie but a goodie. This is the first of many we will talk about in this series. There seems to be 2 or 3 of these vanishing hitchhikers. One being a young girl in a prom dress. Sometimes she's in a wedding gown. But the Lewiston Sun-Journal reports on a young driver named David who picked the bride up by Ruby Rose frozen custard. She asked, "Can you bring me to the church on Route 11? He obliged, and they started going down the road. She asked him where he goes to school and other various small talk topics, but soon she started to complain about being late for her wedding and asked him to drive faster. Once again, he obliged. When they finally make it to the church, she points out a cop car up the road. He turns to look at it. He watches it go by, and then she's gone. He never heard the car door open. He flagged the cop down, told him that there was no one in the car with him when he drove by. Just a man, a teenage boy, alone in a car." So who was this woman? Who could she be? Many speculate it is Mary Knight, who was murdered by her husband George in October 1866. Another story states of the young woman who didn't quite make it to her prom. David did his own research and found that the woman actually was hit along that stretch of road on her way to her wedding. It seems to me she still may be trying to make it to her wedding day. Poland right here. We've arrived at the Poland Springs Resort with a golf course, 2 inns, 11 cottages, and a nice little lodge. We're here to talk about the Presidential Inn. Built in 1912, it's seen its fair share of tenants. It's safe to assume that maybe 1 or 2 of them never left. That's not what we're here for, though. Jabez Ricker was the original owner of the Presidential Inn. He is said to have believed that the water that came from the spring had, quote, curative properties, and he started selling it. So who knows? He may be right, and everyone who drinks Poland Springs water becomes a ghost, because employees have seen him walking around and have reported hearing voices and footsteps in otherwise empty rooms and lobbies. That will do it for this episode. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank my sources, especially Strange Maine, True Tales in the Pine Tree State by Michelle Souliere. She's a friend of the show, and her book and her blog have been there since the very beginning of this show. I think I first cited her in the 2nd episode. I may have cited her in the 1st episode. I can't remember. I did read her a little bit in the 1st episode, I think. You can buy a signed copy of her book, Strange Maine, Tales from the Pine Tree State, as well as Bigfoot in Maine, which is also by her, from greenhandbooksshop.com. I have a signed copy of Bigfoot from Maine, and it's a good read. It's really cool to see sightings that have been in my home state, and one actually fairly close to me, which is wild, but not surprising if you know where I live. Next episode will be Sagadahoc, which will feature one of my favorite stories and a couple more to go with it. So tune in for that. It's going to be great. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, even though I rarely post. Subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube. Become a Patreon backer to get these episodes a day early, plus exclusive content when everyone gets there. You can email us at neatmooseproductions@gmail.com or message us on the Jumping Frenchman podcast Facebook page if you have a story you want to tell on the show, be it ghost or otherwise. I think, that is all the social media stuff. I love you all. Have a wicked freaking awesome day, bubs. Mwah.